Just months into the new Trump administration, and the European leadership are in a state of shock. 2 phone calls between President Trump and President Putin, a couple of negotiating sessions between their respective envoys in Saudi Arabia, and a frank and outspoken speech delivered by US Vice President Vance at the Munich Security Conference last February have triggered panic in the European chancelleries and de facto wiped out almost 20 years of American policy towards Russia. It was the rudest of all rude awakenings. The so-called transatlantic relationship is not experiencing a simple physiological change, but a real metamorphosis. The impact has been so brutal that even one of the symbols of Western mainstream media establishment, the usually sober Financial Times, came to ask, I quote, "Is the US still an ally?" End quote. In his first tour to NATO's headquarters in Brussels, the new US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, first said that membership for Ukraine was unrealistic. Then he suggested that Kiev should abandon the idea of reclaiming all Russian-occupied territory. And, finally, remarked that EU members willing to deploy their troops to monitor a possible ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine could not count on US military support. With these few words, he just delivered a formal farewell to the famous NATO's Article 5 on collective defense. There is no better metaphor than the famous movie The Truman Show to describe the sudden shocking realization European NATO's members are coming to terms with. The new American administration seems determined to throw them all under the bus, Ukrainians included. The embarrassing and to some extent amateurish verbal match inside the White House Oval Office between the US President and Vice President with their unfortunate Ukrainian colleague will be remembered as the symbolic seal of this watershed. Once again, the famous motto attributed to the late US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger revealed itself as true. I quote, "It might be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend can be fatal." End quote. Slogans, statements, and alleged strategic policies portraying an epic competition between democracy and autocracy sound now hollow. The aims to have Ukraine joining NATO, Russia on its knees through economic sanctions to inflict the country a strategic defeat, and ideally a regime change have now been all upended. What we are probably facing is no other than the biggest political, economic, and diplomatic disaster that Europe and the European Union has ever incurred. Let's ask now how European leaders are dealing with this shocking turn of events. Sadly, they prepare to be acting in a sort of sequel of The Truman Show. They are now convincing themselves that in a few years they could replace the United States in both supporting Ukraine and providing reliable defense to the whole Europe. They also believe that their decades-long laziness in military procurement could be fixed quickly and effectively, and that they have the financial resources to do it. They intend to make further debt for an 800 billion euros rearmament plan proposed by European Commission's President Ursula von der Leyen. Most of them will be spent to purchase American weapons for the joy of Donald Trump. And all that while the European welfare budgets have been already reduced to the point of bringing the continent on the brink of a social revolt. They could disgracefully discover that the first use of their massive new armies it will be to quell the revolts of their citizens enraged by the increased poverty. It is just the case to remember that a decade ago, to respect their then sacred debt ceiling, the EU leaders did not hesitate to economically destroy one of their member states, Greece. Today, while the overall debt situation is even worse, they claim that debt benchmarks do not count anymore. But the real question that everybody should ask is, a defense against whom? Well, we are obsessively told that Russia is an existential threat to Europe. It sounds implausible. Russia is already the largest country on Earth with huge natural resources. Its alleged appetite for further land grab then sounds odd. is also in a serious demographic crisis, while its GDP is just a fraction of the European Union's one. It is hard, at least for me, to reconcile such data with the notion of an existential threat. If we then turn to historical evidence, we discover that in the last 3 centuries, Russia has been always invaded by European states, and not the other way around. The first time, in early 18th century, by the Kingdom of Sweden, by Napoleon's French Empire in the early 19th, and by Hitler's Germany, Third Reich, in the mid of the 20th. Try to imagine how shocking must have been for the European leaders convened at the Munich Security Conference last February to listen from US Vice President J.D. Vance that the real existential threat for Europe is not coming from Russia, but from within the continent, especially due to the EU disavowal of its core values, beginning with the freedom of expression. The European Union top players, after having completely outsourced their narrative and analytical skills on the Ukrainian conflict to the Biden administration, a few weeks ago decided to rush into a UK-convened meeting, a country that incidentally a decade ago unwisely left the same union to find a solution to their anxieties. And the best idea they could deliver has been the quite original one, I quote, to work for permanent peace in Ukraine in partnership with the United States, unquote. So, as the US pulls away from Europe, the continent's decision makers have found nothing better than to continue working closely with America. Probably they forgot that when the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, went recently to Washington, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, refused to see her. When it comes to cognitive dissonances and detachment from reality, then, Europe continues to remain second to none, and its leaders really seem beyond help. They still believe that by persevering in the last 3 years of failed policies, they will prevail. And in so doing, they just give further credit to Albert Einstein's famous definition of insanity. I again quote, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, unquote. If a 21st century global realignment of power will take place, it might resemble as a new Yalta conference, attended again by US and Russia, with China replacing UK. Europe seriously risks being removed from the negotiating table to be placed on the menu. Its leaders disturbingly look like the European monarchs during the fatal summer of 1914, when the whole continent was on the eve of its first suicide, the catastrophic First World War. Europe then performed a second, even more catastrophic suicide, the Second World War. Now its leaders are apparently sleepwalking towards the cliff of their third suicide in just a century.